Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be taking you back 300 years to Georgian England, where we will be looking at the horrific crimes of Catherine Hayes. Catherine was one of the last women in England to be charged with petty treason before this charge was abolished and simply reclassified as murder. In Britain, the Georgian period was between 1714 and 1830, and this crime was committed very early in the Georgian period in 1725, so nearly 300 years ago, and 104 years before the Metropolitan Police Act of 1829 established a full-time professional police force in London. It was considered that in Georgian Britain, men were more valuable in law than women. So if a woman killed her husband, she was guilty not merely of murder, but the much more serious crime of petty treason. Petty treason was defined by the Treason Act of 1351 and encompassed the killing of a master by a servant, a husband by his wife, or a superior by his inferior. These crimes were seen both as an assault on the majesty of the state as well as the actual victim, and were perceived at the time to be against the natural order of things. This meant that the punishment for petty treason was much more severe than for ordinary murder. Women were burned at the stake, and men could be hanged, drawn and quartered, these also being the respective punishments for high treason. Catherine was born in Birmingham, England in 1690. When she was 15 years old, she ran away from home. As a 15-year-old in 1705, it was difficult to survive, but Catherine was a very pretty girl and found her way into prostitution. She was employed to look after the needs of a group of army officers in Worcestershire, but after a while they tired of her services. She spent the next few years working in prostitution, or when she could, as a maid in domestic service. Catherine had a relationship with a local tanner and gave birth to a son named Thomas. At the age of 23, she secured a position as a housemaid to a local gentleman farmer named Hayes. Mr. Hayes had 2 sons, and it didn't take long for Catherine to seduce the older one. He was 21-year-old John. John fell for Catherine and they married in secret and started living in a cottage on his father's farm. For the first 6 months of the marriage, it seemed to go quite well. John was working long hours on the farm while Catherine was at home. Catherine, however, needed to amuse herself, so she started to have relationships with other men. The couple lived a very rural life on the farm, which is very different to Catherine's childhood in the city of Birmingham. In 1719, Catherine persuaded John to move to London. This they did, and John set up a business as a coal merchant, pawnbroker and moneylender. The business did very well, and Catherine was given a generous allowance, including servants. This, however, was not enough to satisfy her, and she constantly asked John for more. He was growing tired of his wife's demands and decided she was spending too much money, so reduced her allowance. By the year 1725, the marriage began to go downhill. Coincidentally, at the same time, the couple had taken in a lodger who was a young tailor, 18-year-old Thomas Billings, who was, in fact, Catherine's illegitimate son. She started to have an incestuous affair with Thomas. They then took in another lodger, also called Thomas Wood, who was a friend of Catherine's husband John and was a butcher by trade. It was not long before Catherine was also having a relationship with him. So now, to put it into context, living in the house we have Catherine, her husband John, Catherine's illegitimate son Thomas Billings, a tailor, and Thomas Wood, who was a butcher. Catherine decided that she no longer wanted to be married to her husband. She could have left him. Nevertheless, in Georgian Britain, This would mean giving up all of the luxuries and comfortable life she had become accustomed to leading. Instead, she decided she would have to kill him. Using all of her charms, she persuaded the two lodgers to help her end her husband's life. On the 1st of March 1725, John went out drinking to a local pub with the two lodgers, and they took bets on who could drink the most and remain sober. When they all got home, Catherine's husband John was very drunk, so he went to bed. When he was finally asleep, Thomas Billings, Catherine's illegitimate son, entered his bedroom and hit John on the head with an axe. John let out screams, which were heard by the lady who rented the rooms above. Her name was Mrs. Springate. She immediately came down to inquire about the noise, but Catherine told her they had been having a party, and Mrs. Springate returned to her room. Thomas Wood then helped Thomas Billings finish off John with the axe. They all decided that it would be best to ensure that John's body was unidentifiable, so they cut off his head and wrapped it in a cloth. They then put it in a bucket. As Thomas Wood was a butcher, he sliced up the rest of John's body. They then had to get rid of the evidence, so waited until it was dark and removed the sliced up body from the house. They took it to a nearby pond in Marylebone Fields. They then went to Millbank and threw the head into the River Thames. Their plan, however, was not well thought out, and they had not made sure that the head sunk to the bottom of the river. So it was soon recovered by a local boatman, who in horror reported his findings to the constable. It was taken to be examined, where the skull was found to be severely fractured in 2 places, and the face terribly cut. Nobody could identify John's severed head, so it was placed on top of a wooden spike in St Margaret's churchyard. Despite its appearance, it didn't take long for the head to be identified by 3 men as being that of John Hayes. One of the men who had identified John was a business associate named Mr. Ashby, who informed Catherine that he had been due to meet John to discuss some business, and John did not show up at the appointment or send word that he would not be there. Catherine insisted that her husband had been called away on urgent business. She was getting agitated, and this time she made up a story about John having killed a man in a fight and fleeing the country. Mr. Ashby didn't believe this story, so reported his suspicions to the authorities. In consequence of voicing his suspicions, Mr. Ashby returned to the Hayes household with several constables. When they arrived, to their surprise, they discovered Catherine in bed with Thomas Billings. The pair were both immediately arrested. Thomas Wood had temporarily escaped, but for some reason returned to London a few days later, where he too was arrested. The remains of John's body were later discovered on the 26th of March. The authorities also decided to arrest Mrs. Springate, although they soon realised that she had no part in the crime and was released. A coroner's inquest opened on the 16th of April 1726 to investigate John's death. It brought in a verdict of willful murder, naming Catherine, Thomas Wood and Thomas Billings as the people responsible. This was a very barbaric crime which shook early 18th century London and was widely reported in the newspapers and spoken about in the streets. The case was of special interest because it was one of the first recorded instances where a victim had been dismembered after death. The magistrate showed Catherine her husband's head, by now preserved in a jar of gin, and invited her to touch it. At the time, there was a superstition that if a murderer touched the head of the victim, their guilt would be revealed. Catherine, being aware of this, was quite happy to touch John's head and put on a show of grief for the magistrate. However, she was remanded in Newgate prison until her trial. Billings and Wood were kept separately from Catherine, and her illegitimate son Thomas continued to protest his innocence. When Thomas Wood had been arrested, he was cross-examined by the justices of the peace and confessed to his part in the crime, implicating Catherine and Billings. He told the justice that Catherine had given he and Billings the money to get her husband drunk, and that Billings had struck the fatal blow while he had cut up the body. Catherine then also confessed her guilt and said that the devil had been in them and made them commit murder. The three came to trial at the April sessions of the Old Bailey in London, held between Wednesday the 20th and Saturday the 23rd of April, before the Lord Mayor, the Recorder and several other judges. The indictment against Catherine was for petty treason. Thomas Billings and Thomas Wood were simply charged with murder. Catherine maintained that she had not taken part in the actual killing, but held a candle for the men while they dismembered her husband. She also continued to maintain that the crime was the work of the devil through them. They were tried by a jury of 12 men who heard evidence of the murder, and they returned a verdict of guilty against all three defendants. Billings and Wood were sentenced to be hanged at Tyburn and afterwards to be hanged in chains, and Catherine, having been found guilty of petty treason, was sentenced to be drawn to Tyburn on a hurdle and there be burned alive at the stake. She was greatly distressed by her sentence, as were her two co-defendants, who begged just to be hanged. Catherine and her fellow condemned were lodged in the condemned hold at Newgate Prison, where she reaffirmed her confession but protested the severity of her sentence. She accepted that she deserved to die for her crimes, but very distressed by the thought of the way she would be executed. The executions were set for Monday the 9th of May 1726 and drew the usual huge crowd, particularly as a woman was to be burnt. In the press yard at Newgate that day there were 9 men and Catherine waiting to be executed. Their irons were removed and the yeoman of the halter put the nooses around the men's necks prior to loading them in the carts, where they sat on their coffins for the journey to Tyburn. When they reached Tyburn, the 3 carts were backed under the beams and the hangman secured each man in turn. When they finished their prayers, the carts were moved from under them, leaving them suspended. Catherine was of course able to watch the men die, one of which was her son, Thomas Billings. Attention now turned to her execution. She was secured to a stake set in the ground a few yards from the gallows. A cord put around her neck and passed through a hole bored in the stake for the purpose of strangling her, in accordance with the normal practice of the time. 2 cartloads of sticks were piled around her, and at the signal the fire was lit. She begged the executioner to strangle her before the fire reached her, and he took the end of the cord and began to pull on it, but the flames blew in his direction, burning his hands, so he had to let go. Catherine reportedly gave 3 dreadful shrieks before she was engulfed by the fierce fire and fell silent. She was seen trying to push away the flames with her free hands, but to no avail. Reports claimed that the executioner, seeing her suffering, threw a large piece of wood at her head, which broke her skull and probably killed her. However, she would have suffered terrible burns and shot and have been in horrific pain for some time before the fire or lack of oxygen created by it would have killed her. It was over an hour before her body was reduced to ashes. There is no memorial stone for Catherine Hayes. She goes down in history as a cold-blooded murderer who was burnt at the stake for the crime of killing her husband. Hi everyone, thanks for listening and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please hit the like button and leave a comment. You can also subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notified of the next brief case.